Close your eyes and imagine a world painted in shades of gray. Concrete apartment blocks stretch endlessly toward the sky. A line of people, wrapped in coats and silence, curls around a snow-dusted corner, waiting patiently for bread or perhaps shoes. Somewhere far off, the crackle of a radio reminds you of speeches, slogans, and promises of a worker's paradise. This was the Soviet Union art, the fiery battlefield of revolution. But the quiet, grinding routine of daily survival under a system that watched everything and shared very little. In this 2-hour sleep documentary, we won't delve into dramatic spy tales or nuclear Instead, we'll journey through the quiet corridors of daily life in the USSR, how people slept, ate, dated, washed, worked, and whispered in kitchens when the walls could listen. Let your breathing slow. Let the cold wind of Siberia become a whisper in your mind. You're about to drift back into the Soviet Union, not as a soldier or a spy, but as an ordinary soul just trying to get by. And before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to Boring History for Sleep. It helps the channel grow, and lets us bring you even more calm, slow history to fall asleep to. Now, let's begin. The day begins not with an alarm clock, but with the creak of old pipes and the shuffle of neighbors. You wake in a Khrushchev Kuan of the mass-produced Soviet apartment buildings, named after Nikita Khrushchev. Built with haste and uniformity, they were cramped, cold, and often shared by multiple generations. Your bedroom, it's probably a living room by day. A fold-out couch doubles as your bed. Nearby, a worn table covered in a vinyl cloth waits for breakfast that rarely changes. Stale, black bread, maybe a dab of jam if you're lucky, an endless black tea. The walls are thin. You hear your neighbor cough. You hear the radio. You hear a toilet flush to apartments over. Privacy is a Western luxury. Here you share not just space, but sound, air, and silence. The water runs brown for a few seconds before clearing. Hot water? It depends on the week. The boiler works sometimes. If not, you boil a pot on the stove, like everyone else. You wash from a small basin, standing in your socks to keep warm on the cracked linoleum. There is no morning routine of leisure or peace. There is preparation. You dress in layers, thick wool over cotton, boots that leak in the snow, and a coat that's too big or too small but it's yours. Outside, the air bites. A line has already begun near the bakery. You might stop there on your way to work, but there's no guarantee there will be bread left. The day has only begun and already, it feels long. Imagine the gray light of dawn leaking through frosted glass in a Khrushchev, a 5-story concrete apartment block hurriedly built during the 1960s. These buildings were the hallmark of Soviet residential planning, efficient and depressingly uniform. For millions of Soviet citizens, this was home. Apartments were cramped. Families of 4 or 5 might share just 2 small rooms, each multifunctional. The living room doubled as a bedroom. The kitchen was scarcely larger than a broom closet. Furniture was state-issued and heavily worn. Sagging sofas, wobbly chairs, and particle board cabinets passed down through generations. Privacy was a luxury. Neighbors lived mere feet apart, and thin walls allowed conversations, arguments, and even coughs to travel from one apartment to the next. The clatter of pots from upstairs, the blare of the radio next door, and the occasional flushing toilet created a constant background hum. Heating came from central pipes, and in the winter months, often 9 months long in Siberia or northern cities, radiators hissed with life. Still, residents wore wool socks and layers indoors. Hot water was inconsistent, depending on the maintenance schedule of the local boiler plant, and surprise outages were common. Despite the limitations, people made do. Women sewed curtains and embroidered linens. Men tinkered with broken radios and patched plumbing. House plants adorned the windowsills. A green rebellion against the grayness. Photos of family members, especially those lost in the war, were prominently displayed. The kitchen was the soul of the home. It's where tea was poured from heavy kettles, and guests were received, even if the table was barely large enough for 2. Stories were exchanged here, complaints about the party whispered with caution, and news from Radio Yerevan passed from tongue to tongue. A typical breakfast might be black rye bread with a smear of margarine, a boiled egg if you were lucky, and sweet black tea. Meat was rare and rationed. Bananas were exotic fantasies. Still, people survived, and they often did so with remarkable resilience and humor. Waking up in the Soviet Union wasn't glamorous. It was a ritual of adaptation, learning how to live with less and laugh in spite of it. And for many, it was simply normal, not extraordinary, because they had never known anything else. As the sun crept above the Soviet citizens began their daily commute. a slow, often uncomfortable journey to the workplace. The lucky ones lived near their jobs and could walk. Most, however, joined the bleary-eyed procession to bus stops, tram stations, or metro entrances. City streets came alive not with the roar of personal cars. Those were rare, but with the creaking groan of trolleys and the mechanical ding of electric trams. Public transport was the lifeblood of urban Soviet life. In Moscow, the metro was a different world. Vast, marble-floored stations lit by chandeliers, designed to awe and inspire. But even those grand halls could not ease the crush of humanity during morning rush hour. People packed in shoulder to shoulder, silent and weary. The scent of wool coats, damp scarves, and cigarette smoke mingled in the stale morning air. Strangers were pressed so close that one barely had to hold on to anything. The crowd held you up. Conversations were minimal. Most stared at the floor or the condensation-clouded windows, lost in thought. In smaller towns, the buses were older and colder. Windows iced over in winter, and diesel fumes seeped through floorboards. Drivers, often gruff and overworked, shouted at passengers to step back and squeeze tighter. Patience was not a luxury, it was a necessity. The ride could last from 20 minutes to over an hour, depending on where you lived and whether the snowdrifts had been cleared. In winter, which seemed eternal, the darkness lingered, and commuters traveled in a kind of collective twilight. Reading newspapers was common. So was daydreaming, imagining the dacha in summer, the next family gathering, or a longed-for pair of imported boots. Once near the factory gates or government offices, passengers poured out in droves. The clamor of footsteps on icy sidewalks was the final chapter of the journey, as men and women shuffled toward another day of state-assigned labor. The Soviet morning commute was not about speed or convenience. It was about sharing a crowded, uncomfortable space with your fellow citizens and getting through it. Not cheerfully, perhaps, but stoically. Every day, as the heavy factory doors swung open, Soviet workers filed into cavernous holes of steel and smoke. Here, among the rhythmic pounding of machinery and the hiss of steam pipes, the daily grind of Soviet labor truly began. Whether in a textile plant, tractor factory, or chemical refinery, the expectations were the same. Meet the quota, stay on your feet, and do not complain. Factories were the pride of the Soviet economy. Propaganda posters declared the worker to be a hero, the builder of communism, the backbone of progress. But in truth, the job was exhausting and often dangerous. Machinery was outdated, safety equipment minimal, and supervisors were strict, keeping a close eye on the time clock and daily targets. The smell of oil, grease, and sweat filled the air. In winter, the factory floor could be bitterly cold, your breath hanging in front of you in wisps as you hammered metal parts or stitched endless seams. In summer, it became stifling, with little ventilation and heat radiating off the machines like a furnace. Most workers followed a rigid schedule. Start at dawn, break for a short lunch, and finish late in the day. A bell or a loudspeaker often signaled each phase of the workday. Lunch was usually brought from home, maybe black bread with sausage, a hard-boiled egg, or a thermos of thin cabbage soup. Canteens existed but were often unappetizing. Greasy fish, mushy buckwheat, watery stew. The pressure to meet production quotas loomed constantly. If a factory failed to reach its targets, everyone suffered. Bonuses were withheld, managers were punished, and workers were reprimanded during morning meetings. Sometimes, falsifying numbers became the only way to avoid trouble. Despite the harsh conditions, a kind of camaraderie formed among workers. They shared cigarettes, grumbled about shortages, and celebrated birthdays with tiny cups of vodka smuggled in jacket linings. They helped one another fix broken tools or cover shifts for a sick comrade. In these cold, echoing halls, friendships were forged under pressure. By evening, hands were calloused, backs ached, and clothes were stained with the day's labor. The shift ended not with celebration, but with a slow shuffle toward the tram stop, already dreading the same routine tomorrow. Soviet work life was a machine of its own, relentless, loud, and indifferent to fatigue. By the 1960s, millions of Soviet citizens found themselves moving into a new kind of home, the Khrushchev. These were Lurie's prefabricated apartment blocks, introduced under Nikita Khrushchev's leadership. Practical, cheap, and endlessly replicated across the U.S. They replaced crowded communal apartments and promised a modest slice of privacy for the average family. But the dream of private living came with its own compromises. These 5-story concrete buildings were gray, utilitarian, and built 2 strict minimums. Inside, the walls were thin, so thin that neighbors could often hear conversations, coughs, or even the clink of cutlery. Every room echoed with a low hum of shared life. Apartments were small, sometimes just 2 rooms for a family of 4 or 5. A fold-out couch doubled as a bed. Curtains separated sleeping areas. Kitchens were often no more than a few square meters, barely wide enough for 2 people to move about. A gas stove, a rickety fridge, and maybe a single cabinet made up the entire cooking space. The refrigerator often hummed loudly, if it worked at all. Despite their size, these apartments were seen as a vast improvement over the overcrowded communalkas. Shared apartments where multiple families crammed into a few rooms, sharing a single toilet and kitchen. Here, at least, families could shut the door, hang a curtain, and feel, for the first time, that they had something of their own. Children played in the courtyards outside concrete lots with a single metal swing set or a battered slide. Laundry hung from balconies. Elderly women, called babushkas, sat on benches, chatting quietly, wrapped in shawls even in summer. In winter, thick frost crept across the windows, and the radiators hissed and clanged with central heating from the city pipes. Life in the Khrushchevka was shaped by routine. Families cooked simple meals, boiled potatoes, cabbage, pickled vegetables. Men read newspapers or watched the single state channel on flickering televisions. Women mended clothes or stood in long lines for bread. Doors were thin, but lives were lived quietly. Yet despite the limitations, there was pride in having a home. No matter how cramped, gray, or cheaply built. It meant progress. It meant a child could sleep without hearing a stranger cough in the next bed. It meant a mother could cook soup in her own pot. In a society of collective everything, even a tiny apartment was a symbol of independence. In the Soviet Union, time moved differently, especially when you were waiting in line, and everyone, sooner or later, waited in a line. Standing in a queue, or orchard, became one of the defining rituals of daily life, not because people enjoyed it, but because they had no choice. If you needed bread, you queued. If you wanted milk, you queued. If there were rumors of oranges or sausage at a nearby shop, people dropped what they were doing and rushed there, hoping to beat the crowd. Sometimes, they didn't even know what was being sold. They simply saw a line and joined it, just in case. Queues snaked out of dingy store entrances, winding around the block, through snow, wind, or summer heat. People waited for hours. Elderly women with shopping bags, factory workers in overalls, children holding their mother's place in line. The cold seeped through boots and scarves. Breath puffed into the icy air like smoke. Inside the shops, shelves were often bare. One corner might have 10 loaves of rye bread stacked like bricks. Another might have only a single type of canned fish. If fresh meat appeared, it was often stringy and grayish. Still, it was something. Shop assistants moved slowly behind the counter, protected by glass or wire mat. Transactions were mechanical. Prices rarely changed. They were fixed by the state. But goods did. On a good day, you might get a kilo of sugar. On a bad one, you might leave empty. People swapped stories in line, gossip, frustrations, jokes. They pretend to pay us, one man muttered. So we pretend to work. That kind of black humor, both grim and warm, made the wait bearable. Children played with the ice, tracing little paths in the snow with their boots. Babushkas leaned on their canes and passed around sunflower seeds. At home, pantries were stocked not with abundance, but with caution. People hoarded what they could. Jars of preserves, tins of sprats, bags of buckwheat. There was always the fear of running out. Every apartment had its secret stash. Tea behind books, sugar under beds, dried bread tucked away in case a neighbor stopped by. Queuing was exhausting, but it was also social. It brought people together. It was one of the few public experiences that crossed class and profession. In the Soviet Union, almost everyone stood in line. The professor and the janitor, the nurse and the soldier. In the ache of waiting, they were all just people trying to feed their families, get through the day, and hope for something better tomorrow. If you've stepped inside a typical Soviet home during the 20th century, there was a good chance it wasn't a private apartment at all, but a communalka, a communal flat. These shared living arrangements became widespread after the Bolshevik Revolution, when space was rationed according to the needs of the state rather than the comfort of the individual. A communalka was more than just a building. It was a world unto itself. One long corridor would lead to multiple rooms, each occupied by a different family. Sometimes 4 or 5 families, sometimes more. The doors to their rooms were often papered with old newspapers or covered with curtains for a semblance of privacy. The walls were thin. Voices, arguments, the crying of babies, the hiss of a boiling kettle, all seeped through. The kitchen was shared. One stove, one sink, one small counter, if you were lucky. Each family kept their pans and cutlery on labeled shelves. Every dinner hour was a careful negotiation. Someone cooking soup while someone else boiled potatoes, children running underfoot, the air thick with smells. Cabbage, onions, fried fish, kerosene from a leaky stove burner. There was one toilet, maybe one bathroom. If the plumbing worked, the water pressure was weak. If it didn't, everyone simply had to wait. Queuing, even inside your own home, was a normal part of life. Tensions ran high. A stolen bar of soap, someone using another family's sugar, loud music through the wall at night, doors slammed, words exchanged, then silence again. The cold silence of survival, but also, sometimes, surprising moments of tenderness. Neighbors looking after each other's children, sharing hot tea in a metal cup, celebrating New Year's Eve with a cracked radio and a jar of pickles. Children growing up in the communalka learned how to live in close quarters. They shared toys, secrets, even toothbrush, cups. They played in stairwells and watched the snow fall outside wide, frost-rimmed windows. Life was cramped, chaotic, and full. Not with luxury, but with the constant presence of others. Privacy was nearly impossible, and yet some people didn't know any other way to live. The communal flat became a symbol of Soviet life, of collective hardship, but also of community. Shared walls, shared lives. And when someone finally got their own place, a tiny two-room apartment in one of the new prefab blocks, it felt like stepping into a palace. Soviet winters were no small thing. They were biting, relentless, and long. From Leningrad to Novosibirsk, the wind howled through alleyways and past concrete apartment blocks, turning eyelashes to icicles and sidewalks into skating rinks. Inside, though, was a different kind of struggle. Most urban Soviet dwellings were heated by a system known as central heating, controlled not by residents, but by a mysterious municipal bureaucracy. The heat came from faraway boiler plants, through vast networks of hot water pipes. When it worked, radiators hissed and clicked, giving off steady warmth. But when it didn't, and it often didn't, homes became ice. People had no control over the temperature. You couldn't turn it up. You couldn't turn it off. You simply waited, sometimes shivering, sometimes sweating, depending on how the statron system felt that day. In places like Siberia, temperatures outside could drop to -40 degrees Celsius. Inside, the windows frosted over, even on the inside. Families taped their edges with newspaper or cotton wool to keep out the drafts. Some hung carpets on the walls, not just for decoration, but insulation. Others sealed off entire rooms, living in just one or two spaces to conserve heat. Blankets were essential, thick wool ones, passed down through generations. People slept in layers. Socks, sweaters, scarves, even hats. At night, kettles were boiled not just for tea, but for steam, to humidify the dry, crackling air. Frost formed on metal window frames. Ice scraped along the inside of bathroom walls. And yet, somehow, life continued. Children went to school bundled up like Arctic explorers. Women carried their shopping bags through snowdrifts. Men chipped at frozen sidewalks with metal shovels. Inside stairwells, the air was cold and sharp, but not deadly. Just enough to keep you moving. On especially bad nights, families huddled near the stove, sipping weak tea, wrapping their hands around chipped mugs, telling stories, or listening to the radio. And they waited for spring, for warmth, for the hum of the radiators to return. There is perhaps no symbol more quietly iconic of Soviet daily life than the queue. The long, winding, ever-present line of people waiting for something. Anything. Bread, shoes, soap, meat, toilet paper. A rumor of bananas could bring dozens to a street corner within minutes. People didn't ask what the line was for. They just joined. If others were waiting, it must be worth it. The scarcity of basic goods was a defining feature of Soviet existence. Planned economy meant that supply rarely met demand. Food distribution was inconsistent. Inventory often failed to match what was actually needed. Bureaucracy slowed everything. But the people adapted. They became experts in patience, in quiet endurance, in knowing the rhythms of their neighborhoods. A typical day might begin with a rumor. Word would spread that a shipment of oranges had arrived at the state grocery store. People dropped what they were doing, sometimes even leaving work early, to join the growing line. It could stretch around the block. You might stand for 2 or 3 hours, and still leave empty-handed. To cope, many developed a strategy known as stoica, taking turns in line. A person might leave their place with a coat or bag as a marker while they went to run other errands. Friends and neighbors helped each other, forming loose alliances in the struggle for supplies. Conversations filled the long waits. People gossiped, shared jokes, whispered criticisms of the government. Always carefully, always watching. The line became a strange social space, both frustrating and familiar. It was where one learned of local births, illnesses, or divorce, where one might meet someone new, or reconnect with someone old. Inside the store, the shelves were often sparse. A pile of gray loaves, a slab of questionable meat, occasionally a glimmer of something exotic, a tin of pineapple, a dusty bottle of Georgian wine. But more often than not, disappointment reigned. The product was gone, or had never arrived, or it was being hoarded in the back. Children learned early to help carry heavy bags, to wait without complaint, to not ask for things. Parents whispered explanations. There just isn't any today. And so the Soviet line, the queue, was more than a wait. It was a quiet ritual of survival, a meditation in frustration, a space where time stretched, tempers simmered, and the absurdity of the system was made quietly visible. In the end, it wasn't the cold, or the shortages, or the propaganda that wore people down most. It was the waiting, always waiting, and never knowing if what you needed would be there when you got to the front. In the Soviet Union, winter was more than a season. It was a test of patience, endurance, and clever adaptation. A yearly reminder that comfort was a luxury, and survival, a quiet skill passed from one generation to the next. If you stepped inside a typical Soviet apartment building, a Khrushchev named after Nikita Khrushchev, you'd be met with concrete, cold walls, dim stairwells, the faint smell of boiled cabbage, and the sound of neighbors, always. Because privacy was a luxury few could afford. These boxy, prefabricated apartments were mass-produced during the housing booms of the 1960s and 70s. Their purpose was simple: shelter for the masses. Millions had moved from rural villages into cities after World War II, and the Soviet state needed a fast, cost-efficient way to house them. The result was functionality over comfort, uniformity over charm. Each apartment was modest, 2 or 3 rooms at most, often shared between extended family members, grandparents, parents, and children, sometimes even cousins, or an unmarried uncle, all sleeping in adjacent rooms, separated by thin walls. Sometimes, strangers were forced to share, too. Families assigned to the same flat, given only 1 room each. This was the era of the communalka or communal apartment. Kitchens and bathrooms were shared among multiple families. 1 stove, 1 toilet, 1 hallway with shoes lined up in mismatched rows. You might have to wait your turn to cook dinner, or to bathe, and you could forget about secrets. You could hear a whisper through the walls. Neighbors weren't always friendly. Conflicts over noise, smells, visitors, or politics simmered in the narrow spaces between doors. But in some buildings, a kind of camaraderie bloomed, born not from choice, but necessity. Women traded recipes. Children played together in the stairwells. Elderly residents passed down stories of war and survival in the courtyards below. The furniture was sparse: a folding table, a squeaky bed, maybe a bookshelf with old Soviet encyclopedias or dusty novels by Tolstoy. There was a television if you were lucky, though channels were few and heavily censored. A rug might hang on the wall, not for style, but insulation. And a samovar or kettle was almost always kept warm, ready for tea. In winter, the radiators clanked to life with central heating. Hot water flowed, but not always, predictably. In summer, the smell of soup, sweat, and metal filled the rooms. Laundry dried on lines stretched across balconies or shared stairwells. Children did their homework on kitchen tables. Couples whispered arguments late at night, careful not to be overheard. For all its limitations, the Soviet apartment was a sanctuary, a private island in a world of surveillance and shortages. The space might have been small, the ceiling stained, the wallpaper peeling, but it was yours, your room, your door, your slice of Soviet existence. And despite the cracks, the cold, the leaks, and the lack of space. Many recall those apartments with quiet fondness, because they held the stories of childhood, of family, of survival, and of home. No matter how cramped, a Soviet classroom was a place of rigid order. Rows of desks, chalk dust in the air, and portraits of Lenin watching from above the blackboard. There was no room for idle chatter or creative daydreams. School wasn't just about learning, it was about molding the ideal Soviet citizen. Children began their education early, usually around the age of 7, and wore uniforms from the start. Boys in dark trousers and white shirts, girls in black dresses with white aprons. Everyone wore redneck scarves once they joined the Young Pioneers, the communist youth organization that prepared students for eventual party loyalty. Lessons were structured, strict, and uniform across the vast Soviet Union, whether in Moscow or a remote Siberian town. The curriculum was largely the same: math, science, Russian language and literature, history, and Marxist-Leninist ideology. Critical thinking was not encouraged. Memorization and obedience were. History lessons were particularly selective. Students learned about the greatness of the October Revolution, the heroism of Lenin, and the wisdom of Stalin. After the 1950s, his image was quietly scrubbed from many texts. World War II, or as Soviets called it, the Great Patriotic War, was taught with reverent pride, glorifying the Red Army's victory over fascism. Science and math were heavily emphasized. After all, the space race and technological supremacy were points of national pride. Soviet children were expected to become engineers, doctors, and physicists, not poets or philosophers. Creativity had to fit within ideological bounds. Teachers were figures of immense authority. You stood when they entered. You addressed them formally. If you misbehaved, punishment was swift: a scolding, extra assignments, or in some cases, a call to your parents or even the Komsomol. But schooling wasn't just about academics. There were parades to attend, volunteer work to perform, clean-up days where students picked up litter or helped with harvests. The idea was to instill collective responsibility and constant loyalty. Despite the constraints, many children did find joy. Friends whispered secrets behind textbooks. Snowball fights erupted after class. Girls passed notes. Boys drew tanks in their notebooks. And when a teacher read aloud from Pushkin or Tolstoy, some students were quietly, briefly, transported to other worlds. By high school, students were expected to plan their futures around the needs of the state. Some were tracked into technical schools, others to universities. Admission was competitive, and often influenced by one's social background or political connections. Being the child of a loyal party member helped. Being Jewish or having a dissident parent could hurt. For many Soviet citizens, school was both a burden and a foundation, a place where conformity was drilled in, but also where friendships were made, and hopes for the future flickered quietly between lessons. Imagine walking into a Soviet clinic. The hallway is dimly lit, its paint flaking and the smell of antiseptic lingering in the air. Wooden benches line the walls, filled with quiet, stoic patients waiting for their names to be called. A nurse in a white cap walks by briskly. No one complains. This is healthcare, Soviet style, universal, but not always comforting. The Soviet Union prided itself on offering free healthcare for all its citizens. In theory, this was one of the system's greatest accomplishments, a promise of equity, dignity, and compassion. And in many ways, it did represent progress. Before the revolution, most peasants and workers had no access to doctors at all. By the mid-20th century, hospitals, polyclinics, and rural medical outposts had spread across the country. Even remote villages had a feldsher, a kind of paramedic or medical assistant trained to provide basic care. Immunization campaigns were widespread, and diseases like smallpox were brought under control, but the reality was often grimmer than the propaganda. Soviet medicine emphasized quantity over quality. There were lots of hospitals, but many were underfunded, overcrowded, and poorly equipped. Medical supplies were frequently in short supply. Doctors might lack access to modern antibiotics, sterile equipment, or even clean syringes. Patients sometimes had to bring their own sheets, bandages, or soap. Appointments weren't easily made. People waited in long lines, sometimes hours, just to see a doctor for 5 minutes. For more serious conditions, especially surgery or advanced diagnostics, waiting lists could stretch for months. A friendly connection within the medical system, a relative, a friend, a neighbor, could make all the difference. Doctors were respected, but underpaid. Many worked long hours, juggling multiple jobs to make ends meet. Bribes were common, not out of greed, but necessity. A bottle of vodka, a box of chocolates, or an envelope quietly slipped across a desk might ensure better care or faster treatment. But everyone understood. Medical training was solid, but ideologically constrained. For decades, Soviet biology was dominated by the pseudoscientific theories of Trofim Lysenko, who rejected Mendelian genetics in favor of politically convenient ideas. This set Soviet science back significantly. Mental health care, too, was deeply flawed. Dissidents were sometimes labeled as mentally ill and confined to psychiatric hospitals. A dark chapter in Soviet medicine. Despite these shortcomings, many Soviet citizens remained proud of their healthcare system. It was theirs, a right, not a privilege, and for the elderly, the poor, or those in rural areas, it was often better than nothing. Women played a vital role in the medical field. The majority of doctors in the USSR were women, a legacy of Soviet emphasis on female participation in the workforce. Female doctors, nurses, and midwives formed the backbone of the system. Childbirth, however, was a strictly medicalized and impersonal experience. Fathers weren't allowed in delivery rooms. Maternity hospitals were often cold, clinical, and lonely places. But maternal care was consistent, and infant mortality, over time, improved. In the end, Soviet healthcare was a paradox. Ambitious yet flawed, accessible yet limited, human and impersonal at once. For millions it meant survival. For others, it was a daily reminder of the state's promises and its The streets of Leningrad might have been icy and gray, but even in the Soviet Union, people fell in love. Yet love in a planned economy, under a surveillance state, came with its own peculiar quirks. Dating wasn't exactly forbidden, but it wasn't celebrated either. There were no dating apps, no romantic comedies, and certainly no matchmakers operating outside of the family. If you wanted to meet someone, you usually did so through school, work, the local Komsomol youth group, or your communal apartment building. Young couples might sit on a park bench in Gorky Park or share a stroll down the embankments of the Neva. A bouquet of flowers, maybe even stolen from a city planter, was a sign of affection, but there was little privacy. In a communalka, entire families shared the same kitchen, hallway, and bathroom. Whispers of romantic entanglements traveled fast. Courtship was often brisk and pragmatic. Housing shortages meant that couples might marry young, not just for love, but to increase their chances of being assigned their own apartment. Two people with separate housing applications had a better chance together. A marriage could mean a step closer to independence. Wedding celebrations were modest, with a strong whiff of socialism, a civil ceremony in a drab government building, a group photo under a statue of Lenin, a few toasts with cheap champagne in a borrowed apartment. Still, these were joyous occasions, filled with laughter, awkward accordion music, and guests wearing their finest suit or dress. Gifts were practical. A tea set, a carpet, maybe, if you were lucky, a Chinese electric kettle or a Yugoslavian toaster. Anything foreign was treasured, and Western appliances were often passed down like family heirlooms. Marriage came with its own challenges. Divorce rates were surprisingly high, especially by the 1980s. Life was stressful. Long work hours, cramped living quarters, and economic uncertainty could fray the bonds of even the strongest couples. Gender roles were officially equal. But reality told another story. Soviet women were expected to be workers, mothers, housekeepers, and caregivers all at once. While they made up a huge part of the labor force, they also carried the bulk of domestic responsibility. The term double burden became a common way to describe their lives. Still, love found a way. People wrote passionate letters, passed notes in school, or shared whispered conversations under stairwells. Radio broadcasts played soft ballads from the state-approved music archive, and sometimes, when no one was listening, young lovers danced to smuggled Western records in their tiny kitchens. Even in the cold machinery of the Soviet system, warmth persisted. People fell in love, broke up, remarried, and raised children. Relationships were never easy. But then again, when is love ever simple? Few images capture the texture of daily Soviet life more vividly than the sight of long queues, winding around blocks, down sidewalks, sometimes even forming before dawn. In a system built on planned economies and chronic shortages, queuing wasn't just a nuisance, it was a way of life. People queued for bread, for meat, for winter boots, for toothpaste, for toilet paper, for toys at New Year's, and for fresh fruit in summer. Anything slightly desirable, and often even things that weren't required standing in line. And not just for minutes. Sometimes for hours. Sometimes all day. There was even a term for it. Deficit, or deficit. It applied to anything in short supply, which could be almost everything. Oranges, nylons, cigarettes, furniture, refrigerators. If you heard a rumor that a shop might be receiving a shipment of sausage, you dropped everything. You got in line. It didn't matter if you needed it. You might be able to trade it later. People developed complex strategies. If a line began forming, folks would automatically join it. Even before knowing what the line was for, you could ask, "What are we standing for?" And someone might answer, "I think it's sugar." Others would shrug. You stood anyway, just in case. Sometimes lines were managed with handwritten lists. A woman might keep track of who arrived first, calling out numbers if someone tried to cut. In smaller towns, babushkas often became unofficial line marchers, stern, unbending, and unimpressed by kajumping. The arrival of goods was unpredictable. One day a shipment of bananas might show up, sending ripples through the neighborhood. Another day, the bakery might run out of bread before 9 a.m. Supply didn't always match demand, and goods were distributed unevenly across the country. In Moscow, you might find oranges. In Novosibirsk, maybe only cabbage. People adapted. They bartered. A tin of imported coffee could be traded for shoes. A pair of foreign jeans might be exchanged for a bottle of perfume. Everyone became a quiet participant in the shadow economy, the unofficial flow of goods that helped people get what they needed when the state couldn't provided. For the elderly and those with disabilities, queuing could be punishing, but often, people helped one another. A stranger might hold your place if you needed to step away. Mothers rotated shifts, watching each other's children while they took turns in line. Despite the frustration, there was camaraderie in the shared struggle. Sometimes, queuing even took on a social dimension. Friends gossiped, couples flirted, workers traded stories of life at the factory or office. Time blurred. The cold seeped in, but people endured, one foot in front of the other, inching forward toward the hope, or rumor, of soap, of cheese, of shoes that might just be your size. In the Soviet Union, waiting wasn't passive. It was active, strategic, communal. It was exhausting, but it was also, paradoxically, one of the most reliable ways to participate in the strange choreography of daily survival. To grow up in the Soviet Union was to be surrounded by rules, rituals, and routines. But also, in its own way, by wonder. Childhood was shaped by collective identity, public education, and a strong sense of duty to the motherland. Yet it was also full of songs, games, school outings, and state-approved dreams. From a young age, children were absorbed into the rhythms of Soviet life. Nurseries and kindergartens were common, especially as more women joined the workforce. These institutions provided structured care, early learning, and of course, the beginning of ideological education. Storybooks and cartoons often featured heroes of labor, brave young scouts, or animals cooperating for the greater good. Individuality was discouraged. The message was clear. You were part of something bigger. By the time children reached school age, they were quickly funneled into organizations like the Young Pioneers, a youth group modeled after the Scouts, but infused with socialist ideals. Wearing their signature red neckerchiefs, pioneers marched in parades, helped the elderly, collected scrap for recycling campaigns, and studied the teachings of Lenin. Weekly meetings included songs, pledges, and lessons in Soviet history, carefully curated. Of course, education was thorough, rigorous, and uniform. The curriculum emphasized math, science, literature, and ideology. Students read Pushkin and Tolstoy, but also political texts. Great care was taken to celebrate the sacrifices of Soviet heroes, especially those who died during the Great Patriotic War. School walls were lined with portraits of Marx, Engels, Lenin, and later a child's success wasn't measured just by grades, but by their ideological reliability. Even playtime carried traces of the system. Many toys were mass-produced and utilitarian. Wooden blocks, dolls in folk costume, tin cars. Western toys were rare and often viewed with suspicion. Playgrounds were filled with concrete structures shaped like rockets, tanks, or animals. Some had decaying slides and creaky merry-go-rounds, surrounded by weeds and weathered paint. Yet, children still found magic. They sledded in winter, gathered chestnuts in fall, chased each other around courtyard housing blocks. They built snow forts, played soccer, drew chalk outlines on cracked pavement. Birthday parties were simple. a homemade cake, perhaps a bottle of soda, and maybe a cartoon screening if someone had access to a projector. New Year's, rather than Christmas, was the biggest celebration for kids. Families decorated trees with colorful glass ornaments. Grandfather Frost, Dead Morrows, visited children with his granddaughter Snegoroshka. Schools and clubs held Yolka parties where children dressed in costumes and performed skits. Children's television and films were deeply Soviet, promoting teamwork, morality, and patriotism. Cartoons like Neopagodi featured slapstick humor, while shows like Good Night, Little Ones offered bedtime stories. As children grew older, their world expanded, and so did the expectations. By adolescence, they were encouraged to become Komsomol members, the Communist Youth League. This opened doors to university, jobs, and party affiliation, but also demanded deeper ideological commitment. Behind the scenes, though, children sensed the contradictions. They saw their parents whispering about shortages, queuing for hours, or expressing quiet cynicism about the system. Some kids, especially in later decades, tuned in to Western radio, listened to forbidden rock music, or wore jeans smuggled from abroad. Small, quiet acts of rebellion. To be a child in the Soviet Union was to live in a dual world. One of colorful murals, hopeful slogans, and collective ideals, and another of ration books, cracked sidewalks, and uncertain futures. Through it all, children laughed, imagined, and played, as children always do, even in the hardest of times. One of the most defining and exhausting features of everyday life in the Soviet Union was the queue. It was not just a common inconvenience. It was a constant, unavoidable element of existence, whether for bread, milk, shoes, or even toilet paper. Queuing was a daily ritual that tested patience and fostered a strange form of solidarity. Scarcity defined the Soviet economy at a consumer level. While grand 5-year plans promised industrial might, the shelves of local stores often told a bleaker story of limited choices, rationed items, and endless shortages. A trip to the grocery store didn't guarantee you'd find what you were looking for. It simply meant you'd try your luck. People queued in silence, wrapped in layers to withstand cold winds in winter, or shaded themselves with scarves and newspapers in the heat of summer. The line itself was an organism, self-regulating, strangely respectful. Those who arrived would ask, "CTO Pozlady, who is last?" and remember that face. Cutting the line was unthinkable and could provoke loud public scolding. If a store received a rare shipment, say, fresh bananas or imported boots, word would spread like wildfire. People abandoned plans, left work early, even pulled children from school to join the line. The knowledge that they're selling something was often enough to draw a crowd, even if no one knew exactly what was being sold. Inside the stores, the process was slow and segmented. In many shops, one person handled selection, another took payment, and a third handed over the goods. If you were buying multiple items, you might have to repeat this strange choreography at different counters. There were rarely shopping carts, and if there were rickety, metal things with squeaky wheels. The shortages were not always predictable. One day you might find endless jars of pickled herring, but no bread. The next, soap would vanish from the shelves for weeks. Mothers and grandmothers kept mental maps of which stores had which items, and when delivery trucks were likely to arrive. It was a kind of urban survival skill, honed through years of practice. Some goods were obtained through blat, the informal system of favors and connections. If you had a cousin working at a butcher's shop, or a friend in a warehouse, you might get access to things before they disappeared. But most people relied on queues, often waiting hours for something as basic as eggs or sugar. Even clothing was a challenge. Stores might stock 3 sizes, too small, too large, and sold out. Shoppers bought whatever was available, often several sizes too big, then took it to a tailor. Children wore hand-me-downs until the fabric gave out. Shoes were especially prized. Durable pairs could be passed between siblings, or patched again and again. For many, queuing became a social event. Conversations sparked between strangers. Women discussed recipes, politics, and family woes. Elderly men swapped memories of wartime. Gossip bloomed in the cold air like foggy breath. Some even brought small stools or books to pass the time, resigned to the reality that waiting was as Soviet as red stars and Lenin statues. In later decades, especially the 1980s, the shortages worsened. Under Gorbachev's reforms, certain goods briefly became available. Foreign chocolate, Coca-Cola, Japanese electronics. But demand outpaced supply, and the queues became legendary. Fistfights broke out. People collapsed from exhaustion. Soldiers were sometimes called in to restore order. Yet, amid the frustration, there was humor. Soviet comedians joked about queues for empty shelves. Satirical posters mocked the absurdity. And when all else failed, people found joy in simply finding something. Returning home with a pineapple or a working flashlight could make you feel like a triumphant explorer. In the end, the Soviet queue was more than a line. It was a symbol of perseverance, of shared endurance in the face of shortage, a quiet testimony to how millions navigated a world where goods were scarce, but patience was limitless. In the Soviet Union, truth was not always a matter of fact. It was a matter of alignment, aligning with the party line, the approved narrative, the version of reality endorsed by the state. This made propaganda more than a tool. It was a part of the atmosphere, like the cold, or the queues, or the smell of cabbage stew wafting from communal kitchens. From the youngest ages, Soviet citizens were taught what to believe. Schoolchildren recited verses praising Lenin, sang songs about tractors and factories, and pledged loyalty to the state. At summer camps like Artek, children learned discipline, optimism, and Marxist ideology under fluttering red banners. History lessons focused on revolution and progress, and carefully omitted the darker chapters, the famines, the purges, the gulags. In public life, images of workers smiling beneath wheat fields or astronauts waving from spacecraft were everywhere. Billboards, magazines, and television programs celebrated Soviet superiority in agriculture. Science and art, even toothpaste and matchboxes, might bear patriotic slogans. It was a constant, low-level murmur of, "We are better. We are building the future. We are united." But behind closed doors, in kitchens and courtyards, people talked differently. Jokes called anecdote were whispered and shared. They poked fun at leaders, at shortages, at the absurdities of daily life. These jokes were both survival mechanism and quiet rebellion. They didn't change the system, but they helped people cope with its contradictions. A popular saying went, "We pretend to work, and they pretend to pay us." It summed up the strange doublethink required to survive. People knew the slogans often didn't match reality. They knew the 5-year plans were frequently padded with false numbers. They knew that the West, though demonized in official media, offered jeans, rock music, and bananas. And yet, people played along, some out of belief, others out of fear, and many simply to keep their jobs, their apartments, and their children safe. Expressing doubt about communism could have consequences: demotion, surveillance, even prison. So families developed the habit of speaking in layers. What was said at work differed from what was whispered at home. Children were told not to repeat what their parents said, just in case. Some people genuinely believed, especially in the earlier decades, the revolution had promised equality, dignity, and a classless future. For many, particularly in rural areas, the Soviet system had improved life, offering education, electricity, healthcare, the dream of building something better, a utopia for workers, and sincere appeal. But by the 1970s and 80s, cynicism was spreading. The gap between the official version of life and the lived experience was too wide. People watched choreographed parades on May Day, waving their red flags and singing their songs, then went home to apartments without hot water and stores without soap. The dissonance was quietly exhausting, and yet, some propaganda worked in surprising ways. The focus on space exploration, for example, inspired awe and pride. Soviet achievements like launching Sputnik or sending Yuri Gagarin into orbit gave people something to genuinely celebrate. These moments pierced the grayness of everyday life and offered brief, bright glimmers of hope. In the end, Soviet propaganda was not just about changing minds. It was about managing perception, maintaining control, and preserving the illusion of unity. It created a parallel world, where all was progress, all was triumph, and the future gleamed with certainty. But behind the posters and the parades, people lived their private truths, waiting in queues, whispering jokes, raising families, and navigating a system where belief was complicated and survival meant knowing when to speak and when to stay silent. In theory, the Soviet Union prided itself on gender equality. Women were hailed as the comrades of men, builders of socialism, and mothers of the future. Posters depicted heroic female farmers, engineers, pilots, and astronauts, all smiling, all strong. The state celebrated women as both the backbone of the workforce and the heart of the family, but in practice, the life of a Soviet woman was often relentlessly demanding. From a young age, girls were expected to excel in school, pursue higher education, and enter the workforce. Just like the boys, by the mid-20th century, women were a dominant presence in medicine, teaching, science, and factory work. They operated machinery, taught physics, and even flew fighter planes in World War II. Yet domestic expectations never went away. Despite full-time jobs, women were still primarily responsible for running the home, cooking, cleaning, shopping, raising children. Soviet men were rarely expected to do their share of household labor, and many clung to traditional ideas about masculinity. As a result, women lived under a kind of double burden, working all day outside the home, then doing a second shift when they got back. The state helped somewhat. There were state-run kindergartens and daycare centers, allowing women to re-enter the workforce after giving birth. Maternity leave was provided, and abortion was legalized as early as the 1920s. The ideal Soviet woman was both productive and maternal, efficient at work, nurturing at home, and politically loyal. But the support systems weren't always reliable. Daycare centers were often overcrowded, maternity wards could be harsh and understaffed, and basic necessities, like diapers or baby formulae, were frequently hard to find. A new mother might wait in line for hours just to get milk, pushing a prom through icy streets. Still, some women found genuine empowerment in their roles. Access to education allowed many to rise through the ranks of science and industry. The USSR produced world-class female mathematicians, chemists, and Valentina Tereshkova, the first woman in space, was a celebrated national hero. Others found solace in community. Apartment courtyards became places of exchange. For advice, childcare, and small kindnesses, women shared recipes, mended clothes, and kept each other sane. Kitchens doubled as safe spaces for honest conversations and warm cups of tea after long, weary days. Marriage was common, but not always romantic. The pressures of daily life, low wages, cramped apartments, alcohol abuse, took their toll. Divorce rates were high, and domestic violence, while widespread, was rarely acknowledged or addressed by authorities. Yet through it all, women remained central to the Soviet story. They were the quiet sustainers of life. Mothers, doctors, janitors, scholars, cooks, engineers, carrying the weight of both expectation and their lives were not easy, but they were layered, complex, and filled with small acts of resilience. Whether navigating bureaucracy, queuing for groceries, or raising children in tiny apartments, Soviet women kept the wheels of society turning, often without thanks, often without pause. And when the USSR finally collapsed, it was again the women who bore the brunt, picking up the pieces, holding families together, and finding new ways to survive in a world that had changed overnight. Even amid shortages, surveillance, and political fear, people in the Soviet Union still sought out meaning, comfort, and joy. Especially through holidays and traditions. The Soviet state officially rejected religion, promoting atheism and discouraging organized worship. Churches were closed or repurposed, clergy were monitored or imprisoned, and religious instruction was forbidden. But despite this, spiritual practices never fully disappeared. They simply went underground, or adapted. Christian holidays like Christmas were banned in the early Soviet period, considered remnants of bourgeois or superstitious thinking. But people found ways to celebrate anyway. Over time, New Year's Eve took on many of Christmas's traditions. Families decorated yolka trees, exchanged gifts, and gathered for festive meals. Instead of Santa Claus, children looked forward to Dead Moros, or Father Frost, who arrived with his granddaughter Snegioroshka. These celebrations offered a brief escape from the grey routines of Soviet life, a moment of color, music, and laughter. Fireworks sparkled over icy cityscapes, and children performed songs or poems in school assemblies. Even the drabbest communal apartment might be transformed with paper snowflakes and homemade decorations. May Day, or International Workers' Day, was another key celebration, complete with parades, banners, and speeches. People marched with red flags, portraits of Lenin, and slogans extolling socialist unity. Participation was often compulsory, especially for schoolchildren and workers, but for some, it was still a day of pride, or at least a chance to gather, relax, and enjoy the warmer spring air. Victory Day, on May 9th, commemorated the defeat of Nazi Germany in 1945. It was one of the most sacred holidays in the USSR, a day to honor the immense sacrifices of World War II. Veterans wore medals on their worn jackets, children gave flowers, and old wartime songs filled the radio waves. In a society built on hardship, remembering triumph in the face of suffering was deeply meaningful. There were also quiet, personal rituals that brought comfort. A toast of vodka shared with friends, a carefully prepared bowl of borscht, passed down through generations. A folk song hummed in the kitchen, the sound of a samovar hissing gently while tea steeped. These were the soft, human counterpoints to the rigidity of the Soviet system. Some families still practiced religious traditions in secret, lighting candles for Easter, baptizing children discreetly, or hiding icons in drawers. In rural villages, old beliefs, mixed with folklore, passed down quietly in songs and superstitions. Life under the regime was often strict, but the spirit, human and defiant, found ways to persist. For children, New Year's morning might still bring the magic of toys and tangerines. For grandparents, old songs sung quietly near the stove held deep emotional resonance. And for everyone, a good holiday meal, however modest, was a break from routine, a gesture of hope, and a reminder that even behind the Iron Curtain, people still celebrated love, life, and the changing of seasons. As the decades wore on, the cracks in the Soviet system deepened. By the 1980s, the strain of maintaining a massive, centralized bureaucracy was beginning to show. Shortages became more frequent. The economy stagnated. Discontent brewed not just in whispers behind closed doors, but more openly, in kitchens, in books, passed hand to hand, and in the weary eyes of workers queuing in the snow. The average Soviet citizen had weathered so much already: war, famine, purges, paranoia. But in the final years, there was a quiet, growing sense of uncertainty. The old slogans no longer stirred hearts. The faces of Lenin and Stalin, still hanging in schools and offices, felt like ghosts of a different age. And the rigid control of thought and movement began to loosen, slowly, at first. Then came glasnost, openness, and perestroika. Reforms under Mikhail Gorbachev brought new hope, but also more instability. People began to speak more freely. Foreign films trickled in. Underground rock bands emerged. Newspapers published stories that would once have landed editors in prison. For the first time in generations, the future felt fluid and unpredictable. For many, this time brought relief. For others, fear. The system they had known all their lives was shifting. Some clung to the familiar routines, lining up for bread, warming their hands near the radiator, tuning into state radio. But younger people imagined a different life. One with more freedom, more color, more choice. When the Soviet Union officially dissolved in 1991, it was both sudden and surreal. Flags changed. Maps were redrawn. Entire republics became independent nations overnight. And those who had grown up under red stars and hammer-and-sickle emblems were left to navigate a new, chaotic reality. The collapse brought turmoil, economic shock, unemployment, a rise in crime. Many felt as though the rug had been pulled out from beneath them. But it also brought rediscovered identities, cultural revivals, and the possibility of shaping new paths forward. Today, the Soviet Union exists only in memory, in old propaganda posters curling on forgotten walls, in the fading ink of ration books tucked away in drawers, in the thick accent of a grandmother telling bedtime stories about wartime survival, in the quiet pride of veterans polishing medals from battles long past. And though the USSR is gone, the echoes remain. In architecture, in art, in the rhythms of daily life across Eastern Europe and Central Asia. To understand what it was like to live in the Soviet Union is to understand both the power of an idea and the resilience of ordinary people navigating extraordinary times. So as you drift to sleep tonight, imagine those snowy streets of Leningrad, the clang of a tram in Moscow, the glow of a kitchen lamp in a Khrushchevka apartment, and the voices, millions of them, who lived, loved, labored, and endured behind the Iron Curtain. Thank you for listening, and don't forget, if you enjoy falling asleep too slow, deep dives into the forgotten corners of history, please subscribe to Boring History for Sleep for more episodes just like this. Good night.